Everybody. I'm Caitlin Wilhelm. I work at Cal State LA. I'm our e-resources analyst. I do a lot of work with our e-resources in general, but also working with analytics and helping our liaison librarians make decisions about new resources, canceling old resources, especially in the budget situations we're all in. And so I recently talked with some of my colleagues at San Diego State, and they thought that the work that I've been doing on trying to streamline our usage data reporting was worth presenting on. So that's what I'm doing today. The first thing I was just going to touch on briefly is just that there's a lot of difficulties in e-resource management, especially right now with our budget issues. Everyone is overwhelmed with trying to figure out what we can cancel, what we can't cancel, whether we can get one-time funding for things that we're not currently able to cancel, and so on and so forth. Compounding that is that there's generally a lot of a lack of understanding of e-resource importance to libraries, both within libraries and outside of libraries, in the academic space and outside of it. And both due to that and just due to the situation in libraries generally, there's a lot of understaffing for e-resources. There's often only one or two people handling all e-resource work. That's the situation at my library. I know it's the situation at a lot of libraries. And there can be, in a lot of places, a breakdown between who gathers the stats and who analyzes them. We don't have this kind of breakdown at Cal State LA, but I know that it's a thing that happens at a lot of other institutions. And all of these pieces and more, there's just a lot of moving pieces, and it's difficult to make e-resource management decisions sort of in a vacuum. So this presentation is about how do we try and make those decisions in a little bit less of a vacuum. So we know that there's plenty of data available. We have counter data, which we can get through Sushi, which is now called the Counter API, but I've still been calling it Sushi. And there's, of course, other stats for databases that don't provide counter stats, as well as many other kinds of data. But that data doesn't explain a whole lot on its own. If you have a database that has 10 uses, that looks like it doesn't have very much use, but maybe it only costs you $10. Maybe it's for a very small program that only has 10 students, etc. So how do we move from that data to an actual understanding of the impact and effectiveness of that resource? And then how do we convey that understanding between ERM folks and analytics folks to decision makers, such as liaison librarians, library admin, and those outside of the library? And of course, a lack of time affects all of this. None of us have enough time to do any of the things that we're supposed to be doing. And so we've got a whole bunch of data, a whole bunch of information we need to pass on, but we don't have any time to do it. So the workarounds and hopefully potential solutions that I've found to some of this is that I have tons of lists. I have lists of everything. I have lists of all of our vendors for which kind of stats they provide, how I get their stats online or through email or through Sushi. Lists of databases that we pay for with different funds or with different renewal dates. Especially different renewal dates, then you need to do this kind of data gathering work at different times of year. I'm currently working on data gathering for our January renewals, but I'm not doing data gathering on our July renewals because July has already passed. I'll do July come like March. I have so many reports. Definitely also save your reports. I used to do a lot of work with one-off reports, but then I would come back and be like, I have no idea what I did to get this information. And so I've tried to be better about actually saving my reports. And then this is also part of the look behind and plan ahead workaround or solution. You want to reuse last year's work or other people's work as much as you can to make your life easier, and also create things to make next year use life easier. And all of this takes startup time and energy, and none of us have any of that. But the work that I did last year has made this year a whole lot easier. And I'm not so worried about ACRL reporting and other kinds of mandatory reporting because I already have an idea of what my reports look like, the kinds of numbers I'm reporting, and so on. So the startup time and energy is difficult, but it ends up making things a whole lot easier moving forward. So this is one of my lists. This is my Alma vendors list. This is a program called Notion. And you'll see here that I also fall behind on my updates. Nothing here has been updated to Counter 5.1. It all still says Counter 5. And my licensor labeling is wildly out of date, but at least this sort of list gives me a baseline for when I need to figure out how do I get stats from this vendor. I can look at this list and see, oh, I have to email this vendor. I have to go to this vendor's admin portal. This one comes through Sushi, etc. For this screenshot, all of the vendors in this screenshot, everything comes through Sushi. That's great. Not all of our vendors are like that. So I use Notion. That's that program we just saw, but you can also use analytics for a lot of this information, but that requires you to be really strict about how you use your internal vendor records because you need to make sure that all that information is saved in the same place in each vendor record. That Notion list actually started as an Excel list that I exported from Alma of all of our active vendors and then imported into Notion and cleaned up. So there's absolutely workarounds so that you don't have to do a whole bunch of manual work. You can do a lot of exporting from one place and importing data into another to get at least the basis of these lists. I also have tons of lists of our databases and journals from specific vendors or specific accounts or paid with specific funds. This list that we see here is downloaded from our subscription manager, EBSCOnet, and then I process it in Excel or maintain them as part of reports and analytics. You see that this one has been a little bit anonymized. So these are all different journals that we get through EBSCOnet, and we see in the column on the far right comes with, and some of them come in packages. And so I try and keep this kind of information as up to date as possible so that I know how the stats work together. Like if something comes in a package, I need to be using the usage stats from both journals to be interpreting the usage of the package as a whole and so on. But overall, I just want to have the list of everything so that I'm not scrambling to say later, like, I have no idea whether we actually have a subscription to this journal. I can go back to the lists and check, yes, we have it with this account, we have it with this vendor, we have it paid with this fund, and so on. And so then with the reports that I make, I try really hard to determine what I'm going to need to report on year over year. And so create and save my analytics reports based on that. So this is leading into later the discussion of looking behind and planning ahead, rather than trying to ad hoc create new reports every year. If I use the same one every year, I know that I'm going to get the same basic information, and then I can compare more easily to see like, oh, this database got used tons last year and none this year. What happened? Did we have fewer students in that program, or was there a problem with the database itself, and so on. And then even if not everything you need to report on is in analytics, like report used loosely here, so this is like things you need to provide to your boss, to liaison librarians, to whoever. But not everything is in analytics, like non-counter stats are not in analytics and so on. This gives you a leg up. You at least have something to start from, and you're not trying to create something from scratch every time you need to report. So we see in this screenshot here, these are 4 different reports that I have for one of our EBSCOnet accounts based on coverage info for all of our journals that we have on that account. Different ISSNs is, I'll show that report in a minute. It's to try and figure out, making sure that we're getting all of the information for every instance of that journal. And so I'm not trying to like figure out all of the different ways that a vendor may have put the title in. I'm using something a little bit more standardized. And then the TRJ1 and TRJ3 usage is the controlled access and the controlled plus open access usage. And then TRJ4 is for our direct subscriptions, wanting to look at if all of the usage for those subscriptions is in years that are embargoed in other packages. So we'll talk about those a little bit more. I just wanted to show here that this is the list of, I have all of these reports that I use year over year to do the reporting I'm working on. So here's another explanation of those reports. So the different ISSNs collects all of the ISSNs used by the journals with the same titles. This can be like, we have American Historical Review, but one vendor also calls it the American Historical Review. And that's not pulled in if I only search for American Historical Review. So I want to create this different ISSN report to find all of the titles that are used for that journal, and from that report pull all of the ISSNs, so then the coverage and usage reports use the ISSNs instead, so it's more consistent. For coverage info, we're looking at whether we have the same or similar coverage of a direct subscription journal in a package. So if we have complete overlap or all but a 1-year embargo of overlap, those are things that we would then ask our liaison librarians to look at and say, like, does it make sense to keep the direct subscription if we have basically the same coverage somewhere else? And then we have the usage. What usage do we see? Is the usage in a package higher than the usage in a direct sub? And then, as we said, the embargo usage, do we only see usage when we don't have other access? For databases, not all of our database info can be pulled from analytics because not all databases provide counter stats. So some of these will provide instead playback numbers or number of text downloads or page views. So that can't be stored in Alma and Analytics. But even for counter databases, not all databases use the same counter reports. The big one is database versus platform. Typically, you want to look at the database information. If you have 20 EBSCO databases, you don't want to look at usage across EBSCO. You want to look at usage on each database. But we have had issues before. We had one vendor database that we had this year that I found a discrepancy between the database numbers and the platform numbers, and was told that that's because they only report part of the usage on the database reports. So even though the like we have data, quote unquote, database access to that database, it makes the most sense to use the platform report. So this is another thing that I have had to make sure that I have separate reports so that I'm looking at all of the information in the best way for each subscription that we have. But another piece is that stats may not be provided broken down in the same way that you pay for things. So like we pay for our ProQuest Plan B, we have over 50 databases on that one subscription, but only one purchase order. And so it wouldn't make sense to only look at one of those databases versus how much that subscription costs. So I have separate reports for those kinds of things where we have multiple databases that are one subscription, and how to figure out what the best way to report on those sorts of subscriptions as well when it's not a one-to-one comparison. And finally, I know I've said create and save your reports like 7 times. I have historically been very bad at it, so I'm just making sure that I say it a lot. You want to save your reports based on how you want to present your data. And so we'll move to analytics now. So I'll show you what some of my reports look like. Pardon the Zoom entry screen. We'll look first, this is that Alma vendor list, so we can see this is what I took a screenshot of. If we scroll down a little farther, we can see like that we have vendors that I have to email them for stats, and their stats are not counter. They told me that they're going through an update, and hopefully they'll have an admin module at some point. I have some duplicate vendors. So you see that this is very much still a work in progress, but it gives me a baseline so that I'm not trying to figure out all this information over and over. but we'll open Analytics. And go into the catalog. So I have this folder. These are the reports that I was just talking about in the PowerPoint, and we'll look at a few of them now. This is ones that I've made specially to look at for this presentation. We'll start with that different ISSNs one. This one actually has a ton of extraneous information in it because it's based on a different report and I just didn't pull all the old information out. But the important thing in this report is the title of the journal and then the origin ISSN and origin EISSN. So especially if we look at American Antiquity, we see that we have this same ISSN. For some journals, it's in the ISSN column, and for some, not journals, some instances of the same journal, and for some it's in the EISSN column. So that's why I run this report, to make sure that I'm getting all of the different ISSNs I can, because we'll sometimes get situations where the same ISSN will be used in different fields for the same journal, and sometimes the same journal will have different ISSNs in each of those fields. So then from this report, I would copy out all of these to feed into the next report we're going to look at. But we'll look briefly at the criteria so you can see just how many titles there are for our journals that I'm looking at here. And so this is why I made this separate report to pull in all of those ISSNs, so that I didn't have to have this absolutely massive criterion in other reports. So I have this one report that does all of this big messy work to make the other reports less messy. So then we'll look at the coverage report. This one. If analytics decides to work. I know it had some trouble earlier today, so I'm just very glad that it's working now. Great. So then we see those same titles that we were just looking at, AmerAsia Journal, American Antiquity, but here we see the platform that we get them from, the counter platform, and then what collection they're in, and then the coverage information. So we see here that for the AmerAsia Journal, we have it on EBSCO and we have it on Taylor and Francis. There's not really any overlap here, because we see that our Taylor and Francis one, which is our direct subscription, we get that through from 1971 through now. But the EBSCO one only started in 2024. So this is not one that we'd say like, oh, we have overlap, we can get rid of that direct subscription. But if we look at something like American Antiquity, we see that this one, our direct subscription is this Cambridge Core one. It started in 2011. All of these Gale ones, they don't overlap. They go from 1993 to 2010, but this JSTOR one goes until 2021. So it's not full overlap, but it is a much larger partial overlap. So this is still probably one that we wouldn't say, oh, we can cancel that, but it's something that we would ask the liaison librarians who are making these kinds of decisions to look at. We also see over here in this institution name column, we see that sometimes it says California State University, Los Angeles, and sometimes it says California State University Network. This is because I'm looking at things both that we own locally when it says Los Angeles and things that we share through our network zone. So in the criteria, we'll see that I'm using, because it has these two dashes at the front of each category, I'm using the portfolio details for consortium members folder. Rather than looking only at things that we have locally, I'm looking both at local and network zone content, because even if we have something through the network zone, that's still overlap. That's still worth looking at to see, do we have that content in some other subscription? Here we see all of those ISSNs that I pulled from that previous report. Here we only have ISSN. We don't have the differentiation between ISSN and EISSN, because here we're looking at e-inventory, and at in the previous one we were looking at the usage subject area. But the same ISSNs are used in both. So we use those ISSNs here. And then here we see the institution name is equal to Cal State Los Angeles, or available for group members, Cal State Los Angeles. So this one is when we own it locally or subscribe locally. And this one is when we share it in our network zone. And so that's because I'm using the consortium members folders, I get to see information from both our institution zone and our network zone, even though I'm still in my institution zone analytics. And then we'll look at the usage. And so we see here, again, we see the same titles. Here I also have an alphabetization column because we have some issues here, like we have American Political Science Review and the American Political Science Review, and I wanted those to be grouped together. So I created this column that pulls out things like the and changes ampersand to and to try and pull everything together so that I can alphabetize correctly. We see again that we have a publisher column and then a platform column. So the platform column is the important one for showing us where people are actually using that resource. So for Amerasia Journal, just like we talked about, we have it on Taylor and Francis and EBSCOhost. So we see Taylor and Francis has really good usage. EBSCOhost has 0 usage. That's fine. EBSCO use was not our direct subscription. But for American Antiquity, we remember that Cambridge Core was our direct subscription, and we see, okay, there's 11 unique uses. But then if we look at JSTOR, we see that it's got tons of usage. Even if we were only looking at this one capitalized JSTOR line, we'll have to add up these 3 to get the actual JSTOR usage. But even just this one is way more than that direct subscription. So that's the kind of thing we would show to our liaison librarians and say, hey, it looks like our users actually prefer to get this journal on JSTOR. Do we need to have a direct subscription? So that's why we look at the usage for all of the places that we have access to that journal and not just our direct subscription. Okay, and then we'll briefly look at the database reports as well. So here's the database stats, the DRD1. I do include the searches here, but I don't do any sort of standardized cost per usage work with the search numbers, even in Counter, because Counter stats are not, Counter search stats are not database specific. So if you have something like EBSCO, you'll end up with those searches are not isolated to only that database. So we focus on the investigations and requests for databases, even in Counter. So here I have the DRD1 data for totals, and then I have the DR master report use for unique, because up until Counter 5.1, DRD1 did not include unique item usage, unique item usage. So hopefully next year I'll be able to move to using DRD1 for all 4 of these columns. But for now I use DRD1 for these and DR for these 2. Because for us, we focus on the unique numbers rather than the total, just to make sure that we're looking at the most standardized number that we can, and we're not getting those usage where someone accidentally closed an article and then opened it again, or opened it 3 times for whatever reason in the same session, and so on. And then the platform report looks very similar to this one, but it's the platform stats instead of the database stats. So this is where we get ACS. This is all usage on the ACS platform. And so you wouldn't want to do this for something like EBSCO, because we have like 20, we have like 60 EBSCO databases. But for ACS, that's only one vendor, or not vendor, one collection, one subscription. It's okay to look at it from the platform level. Here it's all PRP1 because that does give me unique numbers. I have the title requests here. Title requests are only for books. So we typically focus on the item requests because that includes book chapters, articles, multimedia, etc. And then finally, we'll just briefly look at the report for ProQuest Plan B. Just to show that we have so many different subscriptions or so many different databases all through this one subscription. So it wouldn't make sense to do cost per use with only a subset of these databases. So I created a separate report so I can keep all of them together, run my sums, and then do my cost per use calculations off of the total. And I'll switch back to the slides so we can talk about cost per use. So I export all of those analytics reports to Excel and combine them in order to give a proper cost per use explanation to our liaison librarians. I typically combine them by hand, which sounds like it would take me a lot longer, but I do know a lot about things like VLOOKUP, and I've tried to run these with VLOOKUP. But because of the specifics of how these ISSNs work and how the titles work, it ended up just being much faster for me to just manually, like, from here to the left is all one report, and then from here to the right is all a separate report. So I just match the lines myself and copy them over. It's not a huge, like, piece by piece each cell copying. So it's definitely not something like that. But to copy all of these over here, it ended up being faster to do it by hand. But this makes it easy to look at one report and see all of the usage together, all of the coverage to see if we have overlaps, and then look at the cost per use. So we see these are de-identified because they have cost information. So for resource A, we see that we have the a lot of usage and a low cost per use. And then we see here that we have not much usage, high cost per use, and then we have more usage here for a package provider rather than the direct subscription. So that's where the color coding here comes in. The orange lines are the direct subscription for each group of providers. So we see that we have provider A repeated because that's the same provider for those separate journals, for journal A, resource A, and resource D, whatever those are. But within each block, so like this block for resource B, this is the direct subscription. These are all package subscriptions. We see that the direct subscription has lower usage than the package subscription. And so that's the green then is marking in this report. Green says we have more usage on a package than we did on the direct subscription. So, hey, liaison librarian, do we need the direct subscription if we already have more usage on something else? And then the color coding in this column is yellow is cost per use above $50, and then not in the screenshot, but red was cost per use above $100. So that was to make it very easy and obvious to see, like, oh, this is an expensive journal. Not expensive overall, but expensive per use, because this could be, not these ones, but we had some where it was like a $300 journal. That's not super expensive, but each use was over $100 because there were only 2 uses or something like that. These are what the database reports end up looking like. I include the date they're paid through, that this year we've only paid them through last fiscal year, and then do the same kind of cost per use calculation. But here, because last year we already canceled a lot of our really low use databases, I moved the color coding down a step. So this was anything over $20 for cost per use was marked in yellow. And then for non-counter data, we want to report in as comparable a way as possible. So I chose things like profiles viewed, distinct documents viewed, playbacks, whatever was the most similar to counter stats as we could. For some, we can't. For some, we only get searches. Unfortunately, that's all they give us. For some, we only get sessions. The most important thing is to explain to whoever you're providing the data to that, especially with something like a session, it might end up having a much higher cost per use because there could be 7, 10, 15, whatever documents viewed during that session, but the databases that give us things like searches or sessions often don't map onto the same kind of views or reports or other kinds of stats. So we just need to make sure that we're not trying to artificially normalize, but also not trying to say like, oh, it's okay if that one has a super high cost per use because it has different stats. And so trying to find that balance in our explanations. So that's that reporting on your reports idea. How best do we report to decision makers? And so I do a lot of color coding. You saw some of my color coding here. I write a lot of notes, emails, notes in the Excel files when I send them. I've also done small group and individual meetings because how everybody receives information is very individual. So even in a small group meeting, someone might totally get it and someone else might be like, I still have no idea what you're talking about. Can you go over this again with just me? And I've had really good feedback this year about having those kinds of individual meetings because that gives me opportunities to explain what all of these usage terms mean, investigation versus request, how we use investigation for ANI databases and requests for full text databases, how to compare the non-counter stats, and so on. Then that next step is the look behind and plan ahead step, especially for those non-standardized, non-counter databases. You don't want to reinvent the wheel every year. You want to pick one stat that you're going to report on every year, so long as they stick with the same stats. They don't always, unfortunately. But if you used plays last year, try and use plays this year. If you use views or searches, etc. And then also save whatever you sent last year. We've had some issues before where someone's been like, yeah, this is the numbers that I gave last year. And I'm like, how did you get those numbers? And they're like, I have no idea. I didn't save the report I ran, or I didn't save the Excel sheet that I sent over. I'm like, then I have no way of finding out if your numbers made any sense at all. And so I try and save everything. I just have a proliferation of Excel spreadsheets. I would rather have too many than not enough. And then in relation to saving what you've sent before, once you've sent it, you can determine what was confusing or missing so that you're able to provide it next year. So last year, I accidentally color-coded two separate things with the same bright green color that you just saw. So I had one liaison librarian make a decision that she didn't actually stand behind. And I was able to go back and be like, hey, this doesn't make sense. And she was like, oh, that's because the color coding didn't make sense. It's like, oh, that's my fault. I will change the color coding moving forward or explain it in a different way or whatever. I've also had situations where multiple stakeholders, multiple decision makers ask the same question. And so it's like, oh, that's something I forgot to explain before. So moving forward, I can fix the color coding, explain that question, change how I'm reporting, etc. Save your reports in a shared folder. If you were paying attention during the analytics demo, you will have noticed that I am very bad at that. All of mine are saved in my personal folder in analytics. So do as I say, not as I do. But this is part of succession planning ahead of time. If I'm already saving things in a shared folder, if I change jobs or go somewhere else, etc., I don't have to scramble to give someone all of my reports. They're already in a shared folder. Relatedly, always include instructions and write-up documentation. And I know you feel like you don't have time for this. I also don't have time for this, but it will make next year easier, and it will make 5 years down the road easier, whether you have a successor or if you're still here but have an assistant, or someone else is doing it next year because your job description has changed, whatever. This slide is very much an aspirational slide for me as well. These are things that I want to do but have not gotten to yet. But they're kind of the next step in all of that work that I've done before. So just some final thoughts. This is absolutely not the only way to report on cost usage or usage in general. But it's the one that has worked for me, and it sounds like others think that it's interesting as well. But the one piece of advice that I do really have is don't use the cost per use section of e-inventory and analytics. Do your own calculations because analytics is kind of opaque for how it makes those cost per use decisions. And it makes some weird assumptions like dividing usage by the number of portfolios you have, or only using usage from one instance of that portfolio. I can't get anything to be consistent or static. And so like, even if you do something completely different from how I do these calculations, just please don't use the cost per use section of analytics. But that's what I've got. So happy to answer questions. I'll stop my share.
Hi, Caitlin.
There we go. Hello, Gabrielle. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, thank you. We do have one question in the Q&A feature. It says, great work, Caitlin. Would you be willing, are you able to share your reports to the community folder in analytics?
I've shared them to our CSU community folder. I'll have to do some de-identification before I can share them to a like wider community folder. But I definitely can look into doing that. I just have to figure out how to do that kind of de-identification. I'm glad that other people are interested in them. And if you're from the CSU, they're already there. So you can already look for them. I don't remember where I put them. Lucy might know where they are.
All right. Do we have any other questions?
If not, that's okay. And if you like have questions, you can email me other times. If you're in the CSU, you can find me on Slack. And I'm happy to do some more like individual talking about this kind of stuff as well.
Let's see, we got some thank yous, and let's see. I was going to ask about the reports. So glad you'll see about de-identifying them. A lot of thank yous. Thank you so much, Caitlin. I know this is a lot of information for all of us to process, and I'm sure everyone will have questions later on.
Yeah, I know this was a lot of information and very fast. Sorry to just throw it all at you, but you will get the slides later. And then I know that they're recording, so we'll see that later. Oh, and it looks like if you're in the CSU, Lucy threw the path to the folders that I shared it into the chat as well. Sorry to those that are not in the CSU.
All right, well, I'll give you all back some of your time.